Close your eyes. Your eyes can deceive you. Tell me what comes into your mind.
Life balance. I see fire.
Someone is killing Jedi. It doesn't make sense.
The Acolyte is a Star Wars television series released in 2024 that deliberately shifts the franchise's perspective away from familiar heroes and instead explores the shadowed final years of the High Republic. Set roughly a century before the events of the Skywalker saga, the series reframes the galaxy at a time when the Jedi Order is at the height of its institutional power, yet already showing signs of internal rigidity and moral blindness. Rather than focusing on epic battles or legendary bloodlines, the story narrows in on secrecy, corruption, and the uncomfortable truth that darkness often grows quietly within systems that believe themselves to be just. The tone is darker and more introspective than many previous Star Wars series, leaning heavily into mystery, investigation, and psychological tension rather than spectacle alone. At its core, the series is structured as a crime and conspiracy narrative set within a spiritual order that claims moral authority over the galaxy. The Jedi are not portrayed as villains in a simplistic sense, but as an organization whose certainty in its own righteousness has created blind spots. This approach allows the story to ask difficult questions about power, accountability, and the cost of suppressing uncomfortable truths. The title itself, The Acolyte, signals that the narrative interest lies not with the masters who write history, but with those on the margins who are shaped, discarded, or radicalized by the system. This thematic focus gives the series a more mature and unsettling atmosphere compared to traditional Star Wars storytelling. The plot unfolds through a series of murders targeting Jedi masters, immediately framing the Jedi not as untouchable guardians, but as vulnerable figures subject to investigation and fear. These killings are methodical and symbolic, suggesting motive beyond simple revenge. As the mystery deepens, it becomes clear that the threat does not come from a large army or an open Sith resurgence, but from individuals who have learned to operate in secrecy, exploiting the Jedi's assumptions and rules. This slow burn structure allows the story to emphasize tension and uncertainty, keeping the audience questioning who can be trusted and what version of events is true. A central narrative thread follows a former Padawan who becomes entangled in the investigation surrounding the murders. Her past connection to the Jedi Order places her in a morally complex position, torn between lingering loyalty and unresolved trauma. Through her perspective, the series explores what happens to those who fail or are deemed unworthy by powerful institutions. Her journey is not framed as a heroic ascent, but as a painful confrontation with choices made long ago, choices that continue to define her identity and sense of purpose. This character-driven approach grounds the larger philosophical questions of the series in personal stakes. Parallel to her story is the presence of a mysterious dark side figure who represents a more intimate and ideological version of evil than seen in many Star Wars projects. Rather than embodying raw domination or galactic conquest, this character emphasizes philosophy, emotional manipulation, and the seductive clarity that comes from rejecting institutional hypocrisy. The series deliberately blurs the line between Sith and other dark side traditions, suggesting that the rigid labels used by the Jedi may be inadequate for understanding the true nature of the threat they face. This ambiguity strengthens the narrative by keeping motivations layered and unpredictable. The cast plays a crucial role in selling this tonal shift. The performances lean toward restraint rather than operatic grandeur, fitting the investigative and psychological nature of the story. Jedi characters are portrayed with subtle arrogance, fatigue, or quiet doubt, reinforcing the idea that the Order is not corrupt in an obvious way, but eroding from within. The younger characters, particularly those who exist on the fringes of Jedi society, bring emotional rawness and volatility that contrast sharply with the Order's emphasis on control and detachment. This contrast becomes one of the series' most effective storytelling tools. Visually, the Acolyte distinguishes itself through a darker, more grounded aesthetic. While still unmistakably Star Wars in design, the environments feel less romanticized and more functional, even oppressive at times. Temples, cities, and remote locations are framed to emphasize isolation and secrecy rather than wonder. Lighting and color choices often reinforce moral ambiguity, with shadows playing a significant role in how characters are presented. Action sequences are more intimate and brutal than grand, focusing on skill, deception, and psychological dominance, rather than sheer scale. The use of the Force in the series is also notably restrained and unsettling. Rather than spectacular displays of power, the Force is often depicted as something invasive and dangerous, capable of manipulation and harm as much as enlightenment. This portrayal aligns with the show's broader critique of how power is understood and justified. The Jedi's philosophy of emotional suppression is contrasted with characters who embrace emotion as a source of strength, even when that strength leads them down destructive paths. This ideological conflict sits at the heart of the series and drives much of its dramatic tension. From a factual standpoint, the series was positioned as a major expansion of Star Wars television, both in scope and intent. It marked one of the first live-action projects to explore the High Republic era, a period previously defined mostly through publishing initiatives. This choice allowed the creators to work without the heavy continuity constraints of the Skywalker timeline while still engaging with core Star Wars themes. The release in 2024 placed it within a crowded era of franchise television, making its distinct tone and thematic ambition particularly significant. The marketing and early promotional material emphasized mystery, darkness, and moral complexity rather than nostalgia. Trailers highlighted combat choreography, ominous dialogue, and the sense that the Jedi were being hunted rather than celebrated. This framing prepared audiences for a series that would challenge traditional expectations and potentially provoke debate about the nature of good and evil within the Star Wars universe. The focus was less on familiar icons and more on atmosphere, character, and philosophical tension. As the story progresses, revelations about past events slowly reshape the audience's understanding of the present conflict. Secrets buried by the Jedi Order come to light, suggesting that the current wave of violence may be a consequence rather than an anomaly. The series avoids simple twists in favor of gradual recontextualization, encouraging viewers to reconsider earlier scenes and character motivations. This narrative approach rewards close attention and reinforces the idea that truth in this era of Star Wars is fragmented and contested. One of the most striking aspects of The Acolyte is its willingness to let uncomfortable ideas linger without offering immediate resolution. The series does not rush to reassure the audience that the Jedi are ultimately right or that the dark side is purely wrong. Instead, it presents a world in which moral certainty has become a liability. Characters frequently act with incomplete information, and their attempts to do what they believe is right often lead to unintended consequences. This moral complexity is a defining feature of the show and sets it apart from more traditional entries in the franchise. In terms of plot momentum, the series balances investigative pacing with moments of sudden violence and revelation. Episodes often build slowly, focusing on dialogue, suspicion, and character interaction before erupting into brief but intense confrontations. This structure mirrors the thematic tension between control and chaos that defines the story. The violence, when it occurs, feels purposeful and consequential rather than ornamental, reinforcing the stakes and the emotional toll on the characters involved. By the time the narrative reaches its later stages, the conflict has expanded beyond a simple hunt for a killer. It becomes a reckoning with the Jedi Order's identity and the cost of maintaining a carefully curated image of moral superiority. Characters are forced to choose between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to truth, even when that truth threatens to destabilize everything they believe in. These choices drive the emotional climax of the series and leave lasting implications for the era it depicts. The Acolyte ultimately positions itself as a cautionary tale within the Star Wars canon. It suggests that the fall of great institutions does not begin with dramatic betrayal, but with small compromises, ignored warnings, and the silencing of dissent. By focusing on the perspectives of those labeled as outsiders or failures, the series broadens the moral landscape of Star Wars and invites the audience to question whose stories are remembered and whose are erased. This thematic ambition makes the series a significant, if challenging, addition to the franchise. As a 2024 release, the show reflects a broader trend in franchise storytelling toward introspection and deconstruction. Rather than reinforcing mythic certainty, it interrogates the foundations of that myth. Whether viewed as a bold evolution or a deliberate provocation, The Acolyte stands as a project that prioritizes atmosphere, character psychology, and ethical ambiguity. Its legacy within Star Wars is defined less by iconic moments and more by the questions it leaves behind, questions about power, belief, and the thin line between guardians and oppressors.